Forget all those internet memes you've been reading for years. Forget the jokes about Chuck Norris not doing push-ups, but pushing the earth down, or his tears curing cancer. Because if you had been standing in the merciless California sun in the backyard of a modest house in Culver City on May 25th, 1968, your brain would have short-circuited. You would expect to see the invincible Texas Ranger, a killing machine who grinds enemies into dust with a single glance. But the reality of that sweltering afternoon was so shocking, it resembled a scene from a horror movie where the victim realizes they are trapped in a cage with a predator that cannot be killed. Right in front of you, hands on his knees, gasping for the scorching air, stands a young Chuck Norris at the absolute peak of his physical form. The reigning, undisputed world karate champion, a man whose name is whispered in martial arts circles. But right now, he doesn't look like a champion. He looks like a man who just ran a marathon through quicksand. Sweat stings his eyes, acrid and salty. His chest heaves, trying to pump oxygen into burning lungs. And in his gaze, fixed on the grass, there isn't rage. There's a total, devastating lack of understanding of what is happening. You're probably thinking he's exhausted after hours of fighting a dozen opponents, or that he just finished a hellish weightlifting session. That would be a logical explanation for an elite athlete in this state. But lift your eyes and look at the man standing just 2 meters away. It's Bruce Lee, and he looks like he just stepped out of the shower. Not a single drop of sweat on his forehead, his breathing steady and silent, and a faint, almost apologetic smile on his face. A smile that scares Chuck more than any punch ever could. The contrast between them is so grotesque, it feels as if they are in different temporal dimensions. One is dying of exhaustion, while the other hasn't even started his warm-up. The only witness to this humiliation is one person, Linda Lee, Bruce's wife, who calmly sips tea on the porch, long accustomed to her husband's guests leaving with their self-esteem in ruins. But to truly feel the tragedy and irony of this scene, you need to look away from the fighters' faces and look at Chuck Norris's waist. There, tied tightly over his snow-white, now filthy and soaked, GI, hangs our dagger, a heavy worn black belt with gold-embroidered kanji. Look at this piece of thick fabric closely. For Chuck, as for millions of karateka worldwide, this belt is a holy relic. It is the proof of his status, his mastery, his invincibility. It is his armor. He put it on today because he was certain the rules this belt represents would protect him. He believed the world of combat was a linear structure: stance, block, strike, point, victory. But right now, standing in Bruce's backyard, Chuck is beginning to realize a terrifying truth that makes him cold inside. This black belt isn't protecting him. On the contrary, it's choking him. Ask yourself honestly, how does a man feel who has spent his whole life learning the rules of the game, becoming the best at it, and then meets someone who doesn't just break those rules, but doesn't even know they exist? Chuck Norris has been attacking for 20 minutes. For 20 minutes, he's been throwing his best strikes, the very strikes that brought him gold trophies and magazine covers. And in those 20 minutes, he hasn't touched Bruce once. Not a single contact. He is hitting air. He is hitting a void. Bruce Lee doesn't block his attacks. He flows through them like the water he so loves to talk about. And that black belt on Chuck's waist transforms from a symbol of pride into a symbol of shackles. He suddenly realizes that his classical school, his rigid stances, his memorized katas, all of it makes him predictable, slow, dead in the eyes of the man standing opposite him. Chuck looks at his hands, then at the smiling Bruce, and one question pulses in his head, an answer to which could destroy his entire career. If I, the world champion, cannot even touch this little actor, then who am I really? A warrior, or just a dancer in pajamas who learned pretty moves but forgot how to survive? Let's stop this one-sided marathon of humiliation for a second and look inside Chuck Norris's head to understand why What was happening in this sunny yard wasn't just a sparring session, but the collapse of an entire religion. Chuck was the king of tournaments, the emperor of a system where a fight is a mathematical equation. You see an opening, you strike, you get a point, and the referee stops the bout. His brain was programmed for a stop-start rhythm, for crisp, linear movements that brought him gold trophies and respect in dojos across America. But Bruce Lee, this little dragon, wasn't playing for points, he was playing for survival. To him, Chuck's style wasn't mastery, it was a voluntarily signed death warrant. Bruce wasn't just dodging hits, he was mocking the very philosophy of karate, and he did it with that unbearable lazy grace that makes your blood boil. He walked around the gasping champion, hands hanging loosely at his sides, a gesture that in any martial arts school is considered suicide, and his voice, calm and steady, sliced through the backyard silence like a scalpel. "You're not fighting, Chuck. You're dancing," Bruce said, each word hitting harder than a slap. "But it's a dry dance. You're trying to swim on land. Your movements are mechanical. You're a robot someone forgot to grease. In a real fight, where there's no referee to save you with a whistle, you'll be killed in 3 seconds because you're wasting time trying to strike a pretty pose." You think this was friendly advice? Oh no, this was a surgical operation on his ego without anesthesia. Bruce Lee was methodically, layer by layer, stripping away Chuck's confidence, calling his style dead wood that doesn't bend in the wind, but snaps. And here is where the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, turning this scene from a sports drama into a psychological thriller. Chuck Norris, known for his cold composure, suddenly broke. But he didn't break toward fear, he broke toward blind, uncontrollable rage. The words about the dry dance were the detonator. Something snapped in his head. He thought, "Oh, I'm a robot. I'm a dead man. Fine, Bruce. Let's forget about friendship. Let's forget that we're just training. I'll show you reality." Ask yourself honestly, what is a man capable of when his professional pride has been trampled in front of a woman, Bruce's wife? He becomes dangerous. Chuck decided he was done playing, done trying to reach Bruce with jabs and tidy combinations. He needed a weapon of mass destruction, the very move that made him champion, a strike that had dropped men twice Bruce's size. He decided to use his signature Mawashi Geri, the roundhouse kick to the head. This was his nuclear briefcase. He knew that if this kick, into which he poured all 175 pounds of his weight and all the momentum of the pivot, reached its target, Bruce wouldn't just fall. He might not get up. Chuck stopped breathing heavily. His face turned to stone. He no longer looked at Bruce as a friend or a teacher. He looked at him as a target that had to be destroyed to reclaim his self-respect. He slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted his foot placement, loading his weight onto his support leg, cocking the hammer of his body. The air in the backyard became thick with tension. Bruce Lee, standing opposite, felt the change instantly. He saw Chuck's pupils dilate, saw the muscles in his thigh tighten. But instead of raising his hands in defense or backing off to a safe distance, Bruce did something that makes your brain scream no. He lowered his hands even further. He smiled even wider. He saw Chuck preparing a killing blow. He read that intention like an open book. And instead of fear, a gambler's spark lit up in his eyes, the look of a player who sees his opponent go all in and is ready to call the bet with something worth more than life itself. In that fraction of a second when Chuck Norris's right foot left the sun-bleached grass of the backyard, time in Culver City didn't just slow down. It compressed into a single, infinitely sharp point of no return. The sound of the heavy, sweat-soaked fabric of his GIs slicing through the air was like a sharp whip crack. That sound was meant to be the final chord in their friendship, turning it into a medical chart with a concussion diagnosis. Chuck put everything into that Mawashi Geri, the momentum of his powerful torso, the resentment from 20 minutes of humiliation, and all the technique that had made him world champion. It was a perfect textbook strike, capable of taking a head off. A killer blow from which, according to all karate manuals, there's only one escape. Break the distance, jump back, go into a full guard, and pray the heel doesn't penetrate the block. You, as a spectator, instinctively flinch, expecting to see Bruce Lee fly into the wall of the house, because physics is relentless. Mass times acceleration leaves no chance for a lightweight. But right here, at the peak of this deadly trajectory, the glitch in the matrix occurs, that Santa Barbara effect that makes your brain refuse to believe your eyes. Bruce Lee did not take a step back. He did not raise his hands in a block. Instead of running from danger, he did something suicidal from the perspective of any normal person. He stepped right into it. At the moment Chuck's leg was reaching maximum velocity, tracing a lethal arc, Bruce took a short, explosive step forward, entering the so-called dead zone, the only place inside the strike's radius where the opponent's leg hasn't yet gathered killing force, but where you are terrifyingly close to their body. Visual silence followed. Absolute, vacuum-like silence, where the street noise, the birds, and even the clink of the teacup Linda set on the porch table vanished. It was the silence that comes a second before death, or a second before a miracle. Chuck Norris's lethal heel whistled past Bruce's back, cutting through the void where his head had been a heartbeat ago. Chuck, having poured all his energy into a strike that met no resistance, lost his balance. His body spun with the momentum, exposing his most vulnerable zones, and he froze in an awkward, helpless pose on one leg, realizing he hadn't missed by an inch, he had missed by a lifetime. But the scariest moment wasn't the miss. The scariest moment was what he felt against his skin. Bruce Lee was standing flush against him. He hadn't struck. His right fist, clenched like stone, was frozen exactly 1 centimeter from Chuck Norris's Adam's apple. Bruce wasn't breathing hard. In his eyes, there was no victor's triumph or malice. There was the icy, calm control of a surgeon holding a scalpel to a patient's artery, deciding whether they should live or die. Chuck, his gaze fixed on Bruce's knuckles, hovering at his throat, suddenly felt cold sweat pour down his back under his GI. In that second, he realized that if this were a real fight, if Bruce hadn't stopped his hand, then he, the great Chuck Norris, would already be dead. His throat would be crushed, his breathing stopped forever, and no referee, no rules, and no titles could have saved him. Look at Chuck's waist at this moment. Our dagger, that famous black belt he wore with such pride, now looked like a useless rag, like the rope from which the corpse of his overconfidence hung. The belt didn't protect him. The belt didn't teach him that the best defense isn't a block, but seizing the initiative. Bruce Lee had just demonstrated the essence of his Jeet Kune Do philosophy, the way of the intercepting fist. He didn't defend against the attack. He attacked the attack. He entered the space of the strike before the strike could finish. Chuck stood, balancing on one leg, feeling the warmth of Bruce's fist against his neck, and his world collapsed. He realized that for all those years, he had been playing a safe game called sport, while the man in front of him was practicing the art of killing. Bruce could have ended it with one movement, a light poke that would have turned the champion into a cripple, but he chose stasis, turning his body into a living monument of superiority. That stillness terrified Chuck more than any beating could, because it gave him time to realize his complete, total helplessness in the face of a true master. Bruce Lee slowly, with that same irritating ease, common only to beings in total control of the space around them, unclenched his fist and lowered his hand, allowing the deadly threat to dissolve into the warm California air as suddenly as it had appeared. In that moment in the Culver City backyard, something greater than the end of a sparring session happened. It was the moment gravity returned to its place. Chuck Norris was finally able to set his foot on the ground, feeling the tremors of the shock he'd just experienced travel through his spine to his heels. You expect Bruce to start lecturing? to revel in his superiority like winners in bad martial arts movies. But here, the conveyor belt principle kicks in, keeping you on edge. Bruce didn't utter a single word of triumph. He just smiled, not predatory, but warmly, almost brotherly, and pointed a finger at Chuck's chest, where the champion's heart was still trying to leap out. "You're open, Chuck," he whispered, and in that whisper was more truth than in all the karate manuals Norris had ever read. "You're so busy trying to hit hard that you forget to be alive. Your form is perfect, but it is dead." Chuck Norris stood there, gulping air, looking at Bruce as if seeing him for the first time. His expensive snow-white gi was now soaked in sweat and dirt, and that very black belt, our narrative dagger, which half an hour ago seemed a symbol of his invincibility, now felt like a heavy, wet rope, constricting his waist and cutting off his oxygen. In that second, an intellectual orgasm of realization occurred. Chuck understood that the belt was a lie. It was just a piece of dyed fabric, providing a false sense of security. It guarantees you know the rules, but it doesn't guarantee you'll survive when you meet someone who despises those rules. Norris realized that all his titles, all his trophies, were a currency that held no value in Bruce Lee's world, the world of pure, distilled efficiency. They sat down on the grass, and what began as a battle of egos turned into a lesson that lasted 4 hours. Chuck, a man accustomed to teaching others, suddenly found himself in the role of a student, hungrily absorbing every word. He tried to attack again and again, but every time the result was the same. Bruce was water slipping through fingers, and Chuck was the stone that sinks. Later, in one of the most candid interviews of his life, Norris would admit to something that would be professional suicide for any other fighter. "I was the world champion. I was at my peak. But in 4 hours of continuous fighting, I couldn't touch him once. Not once. He could have killed me at any moment he wanted, but he just played with me like a cat with a ball of yarn." That admission is worth more than any gold. Bruce Lee didn't just defeat Chuck that day. He took him apart and put him back together. He showed him that the dry dance of classical stances is a path to the grave, and that true strength is born not from rigidity, but from fluidity. That black belt lying next to them on the grass as they drank cold tea brought by Linda ceased to be a fetish. It became just an accessory, a reminder that there is a level of mastery where belt colors don't matter. At that level, you aren't fighting an opponent. You are fighting physics itself, and Bruce Lee was the only man on Earth who managed to negotiate with those laws. That day in the sunny yard, Chuck Norris, the karateka, trapped by rules, died, and the universal fighter who would later become a cinema legend was born. But he would always remember exactly who taught him that the best defense isn't a block, but a step toward danger, taken in the perfect fraction of a second. Today, when we rewatch the cult final scene of the movie Way of the Dragon, where Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris engage in a death match beneath the ancient arches of the Roman Colosseum, we are, without knowing it, witnessing not just brilliant choreography, but a documentary reproduction of that very day in the Culver City backyard. You probably think that the tension, the caution, and that almost mystical fear in Chuck Norris's eyes on screen are the result of acting lessons. That's the illusion we find comfortable to believe. But the truth is that Chuck Norris was never a great actor. He was a great fighter who didn't know how to lie with his body language. What you see in the frame isn't acting. It's triggered muscle memory. It's the echo of the humiliation he experienced in 1968 when he realized his titles were worthless in the face of a force of nature. Bruce Lee, as the director of that scene, forced his friend to relive that nightmare again, but this time in front of the cameras, immortalizing his superiority in celluloid so that even half a century later, no one would doubt who the teacher was and who was the eternal student. Remember that black belt, our dagger, which Chuck tied with such pride before sparring, and which ended up being a useless rag, unable to protect him from the dragon's speed. In Bruce Lee's philosophy, this object transformed into one of the most quoted and devastating phrases in martial arts history. "A belt is only good for holding up your pants so they don't fall down." In those words, tossed out with the same ease as his strikes, lies the entire essence of Bruce, a man who declared war on pathos, rituals, and ranks, worshipping only raw, brutal, and beautiful functionality. He stripped the mystical husk off the martial arts, showing that in a real fight, the color of the fabric around your waist doesn't matter. What matters is how fast you can turn your body into a weapon. But this story leaves us alone with a question that sits like a splinter in the mind of every fan, one that hasn't found rest even decades after Bruce's death. We know he stopped the strike. We know he spared Chuck in that yard. But let's set aside sentimentality and turn on cold logic. What if this hadn't been a friendly meeting under the watchful eye of his wife, but a fight to the death in a filthy Hong Kong alleyway where there are no rules, no honor, and no tomorrow? Was Chuck, with his colossal mass, his tournament war experience, and his tank-like resilience, capable of finally catching Bruce if Bruce had made one single microscopic mistake? After all, in a fight, as in life, one miss is enough for the hunter to become the prey. Or was Bruce Lee truly a being of a different order? A superhuman for whom even a world champion was nothing more than a slow, clumsy target destined for defeat before the clash even began? Whose side are you on in this hypothetical but irresistible finale that we replay in our heads over and over? Do you believe in Bruce, whose speed and genius break the laws of physics and who proved that technique always beats mass? Or do you, deep down, bet on Chuck, whose power and unbreakable spirit might have turned the tide if the fight had lasted longer, turning the clash into a war of attrition? Who was Bruce that day? A wise teacher who saved a friend from dangerous delusions, or an arrogant demon who showed a man his own insignificance for his own pleasure? Write one word in the comments: Bruce or Chuck. I'll be waiting for your verdict, because it is in this choice that the answer lies to the eternal question of what matters more in the fight for your life: being an indestructible stone wall, or being the water that wears that wall down and sweeps it away, leaving nothing behind but a legend.